Do you struggle with falling asleep or staying asleep? Maybe you're a hot sleeper, an athlete, a menopausal woman, or just someone who struggles with night sweats. Well, I have a product recommendation that might help. The Dock Pro is the coldest and most comfortable sleep system available. It creates an environment that meets the body's natural need for lower core temperatures, promoting deeper, restorative sleep. It's easy to use, maintain, and discreetly store under the bed. The sleep system includes ChiliPad Pro, which features a completely tubeless design. Instead of tubes, their cooling mattress pad has a high-stretch urethane membrane that allows for 5 times more cooling contact to the sleeper's body than previous models. This amazing technology is what made the Dock Pro sleep system a CES Innovation Award honoree and a complete game changer for anyone who struggles to fall and stay asleep. I use one myself, and I can't live without it. You can go to kresser.co/sleepme to receive 10% off the Dock Pro using the code Kresser10 at checkout. Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week I'm really excited to welcome Beal as my guest. He's a research advisor on the knowledge leadership team at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, where he generates evidence to guide programs and mobilize knowledge related to global nutrition and food systems. His research seeks to understand what people eat, why, how it impacts their health, and how to sustainably improve diets and human health. He holds a PhD from the University of California, Davis, where he was a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow. I've became aware of Ty's work several years ago, and in this podcast, I particularly want to focus on a new study that he's just published, which I think is a landmark study when it comes to looking at micronutrient density in foods. And really, I hope is going to put to rest a lot of the misconceptions and misunderstandings in the nutrition community about which foods are most nutrient dense, especially when we consider things like bioavailability. So I've talked a lot about these concepts on my appearances on the Joe Rogan Show and in my articles, but this new study really fills in some of the missing gaps, again, particularly related to bioavailability and anti-nutrients, and what we can now reliably conclude from the research when it comes to how to make sure that people are getting enough of the essential nutrients that we need in our diet, both in the developing world and in developed countries like the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, etc. I think you'll really enjoy this episode, so let's dive in. Ty, welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So just curious about your backstory. Like, how did you get interested in this field that you're working in now, understanding nutrition and food sources of micronutrients, food supply, how that affects people both globally and in the US? Like, what drew you to this work?
Yeah, so I actually got interested in nutrition before I started going to school for it. And so I started listening to different podcasts, including yours. It's one of the first one I listened to back in 2012. And I changed my diet and had a lot of health issues resolve. And then family members, my parents, siblings, and also some friends changed their diet and saw some really big impacts. And so I was pretty inspired to do something with nutrition if I could, but I didn't have a major background in it. And so I was also at the same time interested in geography and agriculture and kind of the diversity of, environmental sustainability and food production and all of that. I had an organic garden for many years when I was younger, so I was always interested in that. So I ended up going to school at UC Davis for a PhD in geography, and by chance, there happened to be a program there focused on global nutrition, and it wasn't formally allowed for geography students because there hadn't really been that interest, but I applied for that program to be joined to the geography program, but I was actually the first student to graduate with what's called the designated emphasis. So I had a mix of, geography classes, ecology classes, and then a lot of nutrition epidemiology. My lab, interestingly, had a mix of ecology students, agronomy students, and geography students. So it was a really broad diversity of people.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing synthesis of disciplines, especially for what we need now and where we're headed. This understanding of how food systems and ecology interact with, micronutrient density of foods. And, this is something where there's more research happening from folks like you and Stefan van Vliet and others who are really exploring this territory. And it's great to see a more holistic approach, I think, to these topics, because historically, as you know, in academia, people can get really siloed in their particular area of specialization and not really see the forest. And it's important to see the forest, because that's, especially when it comes to food, there's so many factors that interact that affect food quality. So it sounds like a really cool program.
Absolutely. I know a lot of people hated that diversity because there was sort of, what do I focus on? Who's going to be my advisor? And I just loved it. So yeah, I think
Cool.
it's needed. You're absolutely right. The systems perspective in food systems is really important.
Great. So tell us a little bit about your work at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. I know you focused a lot on undernutrition, the burden of undernutrition worldwide, particularly in the developing world. So maybe just give us a little background on GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and set this up with some statistics on, on undernutrition worldwide and how that's impacting people in the developing world.
Sure. So GAIN, or Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, is really focused on trying to improve access to safe, nutritious, foods in a sustainable way. And we do a lot of different programs in Africa and in Asia. So we do things like fortification of foods to improve, salt, iodized salt is important, other nutrients. But we do a lot of work actually to try to improve the diversity of foods and improve the affordability of foods. And how do you intervene to actually make changes in the market where you can improve access? So I've always been really drawn to kind of a foods first approach, because I think, nutrition is very complex, and being a little bit too reductionistic, you can miss a lot of the benefits of food. So I've been kind of tended to lean towards that in my own research and work at GAIN, but I really appreciate kind of the balance that we kind of need all sorts of approaches to try to improve nutrition, especially for people who are living in poverty and don't have access to really diverse diets. When you look at the burden of undernutrition worldwide, it's quite staggering. Well, a statistic I was just reading yesterday, that 25,000 people die every day from hunger or undernutrition, and that's including over 10,000 children. That's just pretty staggering. I mean, you think about the wars going on right now, which are devastating, but hunger is still one of the number one causes of death and suffering. So particularly when you look at undernutrition for beyond hunger, we see anemia in about 571 million women of 15 to 49 years of age. And that has a lot of consequences on, energy development. It can have severe consequences to quality of life. About 150 million children are stunted. This is children under 5 years of age. Stunting has a huge impact on economies. It has a huge impact, of course, on the children's lives. There's rapid development and growth that takes place in the early, especially 6 to 23 month age, when complementary foods are first introduced. And so stunting can have lifelong consequences. And really, there's an intergenerational cycle where you have stunted parents who often are at greater risk of giving birth to preterm children or children who are at risk of stunting. So it's really important to intervene during that young child, the maternal and child nutrition phase. Another stat I think that's many people maybe aren't aware of is that 1 billion people are estimated to not consume enough protein. And so we think in the US and other high income countries, we think, well, protein's not really an issue. And, you can make that case. Protein deficiency isn't an issue. There may be optimal amounts of protein that we're not meeting. But in general, in much of the developing world, you actually see people not even getting enough protein. And then the people who do, children who get enough protein, according to recommended intakes, are often deficient in certain essential amino acids. So the full story is not just protein, of course, it's the quality of the protein. And then lastly, I'll just say a statistic from a paper that we just finished writing. It's under CDC clearance, so we expect to submit this month in March. But we estimate that 1.6 billion children under 5 years and women 15 to 49 years have at least one micronutrient deficiency. So that's it's over half of children. That's about 2 in 3 women of reproductive age. And the surprising stat there, not so much that deficiencies are more common in low and middle income countries. So in places like India, they can be as common as 9 in 10 individuals have at least one deficiency. And oftentimes there are several deficiencies coexisting. But in high income countries, in the US, about 1 in 3, so about 33% of women have at least one deficiency. In the UK, it's about 1 in 2. And so iron deficiency is pretty common even in these contexts, 20% or more in the US and the UK. So I think that's an important point to highlight. It's not as big of an issue as it is in low and middle income countries, but certainly undernutrition is not negligible in all contexts.
So I'd love to ask you a question about that, which I've often wondered about. How is deficiency being defined in this context? And what is deficiency? Is that according to the RDA? Is it yeah? What are the metrics that you use in in all of those statistics and in the studies to define deficiency?
Sure. So there are a lot of different ways to get at some measure of inadequacy in the diet. So at the very the highest level, it's kind of a crude way of doing this is looking at food supplies. So what is the food that's available for people to consume? You kind of compare that to the average recommended intakes, and you can make some guesses about the inadequacies in the food supply. The next level is when you look at dietary intake. So this is something like a 24-hour recall, where individuals are asked to respond to the foods they've consumed in the past 24 hours. It's quantitative. There, you get an estimate of what's called prevalence of inadequacy or inadequate intake. And what we've done in this study is to look at micronutrient status biomarkers. So this is actually measuring different biomarkers in the body to understand what is the level of deficiency. And these there are certainly a lot of uncertainties. So there's serum ferritin, there's serum retinol, etc. These types of biomarkers, but it gives us a better sense of what is the actual burden in individuals, because oftentimes the dietary data itself doesn't always give us a full picture. So what we're looking at is the micronutrient status biomarkers. But I think one thing that's important to note is that we only have data on a few micronutrients, and we have pretty limited data at that. So if you think about there are dozens of essential micronutrients, we're only estimating for the data we have. The deficiency risk is actually probably quite a bit higher than we're able to capture from the available data.
And then even, just more of a kind of 30,000-foot view question is like, is deficiency defined as the what will lead to acute symptoms, chronic symptoms, both? And, how does that relate to what even might be an optimal intake? I assume those are all different things. You've got the level of vitamin C intake that's required to prevent scurvy, but that's not necessarily the same as the intake that's required to promote optimal immune function and antioxidant status, right? So
Yeah.
how does I imagine this is just incredibly complex and difficult, because a lot of those optimal amounts haven't even been necessarily quantified, or at least accepted by kind of the mainstream science at this point.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We don't have a lot of consensus. That's the truth. When you talk about what a deficiency is, oftentimes we think of these things, or the WHO provides public health significance or public health guidance. We don't have a lot of consensus on, if a biomarker says this, and X% of the population has this, what is that significant? And you're absolutely right that what we're looking at for the most part is some sort of consequence that's significant. So it's not always severe, like it's going to be life threatening right away. It can actually lead to, a deficiency for a longer period of time can have consequences. So we're trying to find the balance. We do our best to use cutoffs or thresholds that have some consensus, and we actually have an advisory panel. So this study was funded by USAID, so U.S. citizens' tax dollars, and we actually have an advisory panel that provides these checks and balances, where we met regularly, and they're experts, and they say, well, what's the consensus? Which type of indicator? What type of adjustment for inflammation, et cetera? There's many different complexities to it, and so we try to get at our best guess. But of course, there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think in large part this effort is an advocacy piece because there really haven't been any good estimates of the number of people deficient. There's a number that was cited about 30 years ago in a WHO document that's 2 billion people are micronutrient deficient, and I've cited that as well in different contexts, but there's no real evidence behind that other than anemia. So it's kind of the total number of people with anemia. So we set out to do this looking actually at micronutrient status biomarkers. And of course, the challenge there is we were only able to include children under 5 and women 15 to 49. So if you think about 1.6 billion, but that's only maybe a quarter of the population, you're looking at probably, well up to 3 billion potentially with the deficiency. So
Yeah,
it's not a small
that's
issue.
not at all. And the one of the myths is that this only affects people in the developing world, which I want to come back to in a moment. But I'll just give an example of how complex this really can be, and or maybe we can talk about a couple just to give people an idea. And I think it's obviously a significant challenge from a research perspective, because what might constitute adequacy in terms of blood level of a particular nutrient for one person might not be the same level for another person, depending on many other factors. And I think that makes this really some of some of those factors being known, and some of those factors maybe not even being fully known or understood at this point. And that might involve, like, what's their efficiency in converting a precursor nutrient to the active form of that nutrient, for example. And that can vary by, in some cases by, as it's as low as 1 to 3%, and could be up to 20 or 30% in somebody else. So you're going to, with the given level of intake of something like beta carotene, one person's able to convert that into retinol at a sufficient level, and then the next person is not, and they end up with a retinol deficiency, or not enough retinol. B12 is something that's been interesting to me. So I'm curious to know if you recall off the top of your head what the threshold range was, because I've seen, anywhere from 200 to 350 as the bottom end of the range. But I've also seen a ton of research suggesting that levels of 200 to 400, you can start seeing some of the telltale signs of B12 deficiency, even in terms of the impact that has on DNA. And so, that's an area where, like, when you look at studies on the impacts of B12 deficiency, it's problematic because every study is using a different cutoff to define what deficiency actually is. So how did you approach things like that? Was it the panel that kind of decided what the cutoff was and what you defined as deficiency?
Yeah, absolutely. And this paper, it's going to be underwhelming if in the sense that we're not going to get into all of those details for the individual nutrients and kind of the severity of the disease and what does this mean, and all the uncertainties, just because of course we have limited space and ability to
Yeah.
do that. But I think you're absolutely right. There are a lot of questions, and B12, I don't know that the thresholds that you're referring to off the top of your head. We used thresholds that have been recommended in the latest literature, and the panel agreed upon. But one thing that I do know is that absorption does not usually aren't able to absorb too much more than the recommended intakes. And so I think what you're probably highlighting is that when you have inadequate intakes over an extended period of time, you can really develop a deficiency that can have really severe consequences, and actually is hard to correct. It's not the same as just like, okay, now just start eating vitamin B12 and you'll be fine. It's like,
Yeah.
wow, your body missed out on this for years. And so I think that's a concern, because it may be very subtle at first, and then by the time it's severe, there may be consequences that are too late to reverse.
This is my huge concern with vegan diets in children, because some studies have shown that even after, when kids have later, in their teens or adolescent years, reintroduced animal sources of B12, which are really the only sources of B12, but it has not corrected the issues that were caused by the extended lack of B12 in their diet, and it appears that some of those effects can be irreversible over the long term. So it is, I think, a very important thing for people to be aware of, and whatever decision that they make, just to be sure that it's coming from an informed place, and not a place, because there's so much misinformation out there about how you can meet these nutrient needs that just is not backed up by scientific evidence. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I share your concern. I think when you have passionate vegans who are kind of advocating, look, all you need to do is take the supplement and or take the fortified food. I think it is possible to do that for B12 for many people, but I think it's important to remember. Think about the population level. It's not something that's going to be easy for everybody to make sure. And it's one thing if you have access to all the fortified foods or the supplements and you can remember to do that regularly. The good thing about an omnivorous diet is you don't have to think about it as much. If you consume diverse foods, you're going to get, a lot of your nutrient needs that way. And then the other thing is in many contexts, probably the majority of contexts worldwide, there is not really consistent access to fortified foods and
Yeah.
supplements. And so right there, it's like if children are of course the most vulnerable because they don't necessarily have a choice about it if their parents are going to be doing something. So I would be concerned about that as well, and definitely advocate for if you're going to do something like that, please, check with your doctor or, check your micronutrient status and make sure you really are consuming enough nutrients.
Yeah, and just like in the case of B12, there's often an idea in the vegan community that you can just eat spirulina or algae because it does contain, B12, but that those are actually B12 analogs like cobamide, which don't have the same impact on B12 status that consuming B12 from an animal source would have, or even a supplement source of, adenosylcobalamin or methylcobalamin or hydroxycobalamin, which is going to be well absorbed. So there's a lot of misunderstanding out there, and it's so polarized, unfortunately, like everything else these days, that vegans are typically getting their information from vegan sources and ignoring anything that somebody like me might say, and vice versa. And so it's really hard for people to make sense of what is actually supported in the scientific literature. I want to turn our attention to the paper that you recently published with a colleague. Is her name, is that Flaminia Ortenzi? Am I saying that right?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, so the paper is called Priority Micronutrient Density in Foods. And give us a brief summary of what you set out to study in this paper.
Yeah, so I think I want to just say from this paper, we did not have any preconceived ideas or objectives about trying to make certain foods look better or worse. We are interested in improving undernutrition in people's lives. And so our goal, this built on some work that I had been involved with for a few years. I led a project, at least on the gain side, with UNICEF to look at the micronutrient gaps in young children's diets. And this is children 6 to 23 months, and the affordability of those foods when you look at nutrient density and as opposed to just the price or per kilogram or price per calorie. And from that work, we actually really over all of these different working streams, inadequacy of diets, micronutrient deficiencies, all these different data sets, we looked at what are the most common nutrient deficiencies and inadequacies in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, et cetera. And what we found, it's highly dependent on what data you have available, but really iron is very common, zinc deficiency, folate, calcium, B12, and vitamin A. And there are others, of course, but there's limited data on others. And so and there's also sort of an issue of trying to quantify that properly in food for other nutrients. So we sort of stuck to these nutrients, and the other reason these were the focal point is that in the food composition databases, so these are a database that looks at the nutrients in foods. We wanted to go beyond the USDA database, which is very kind of US centric focused. It's a great database, it's amazing, but we also wanted to try to capture a diversity of foods because we're interested, in globally in populations that don't have diverse diets and who are really suffering from this burden of micronutrient malnutrition. And so we just wanted to get a global overview of which foods are the top sources of these different nutrients. We wanted to know per nutrient because sometimes, there are programs to, vitamin A supplementation or iron deficiency, whichever nutrient may be a focus priority in a country. And we wanted to get a sense overall, nutrient density wise, because foods are often not quantified like that. It's, even you think about people say, oh, nutritious foods, eat whole grains, eat eat diversity of fruits and vegetables. Now, those can be healthy foods and contribute to healthy diets, but there's actually quite a range of nutrient density when you look at foods and trying to account for bioavailability, and really looking at the nutrients that are of greatest public health concern, particularly in our case in low and middle income countries. And so we combined a bunch of different databases from Latin America, from Africa, and Asia, as well as the USDA database, to say, here's the median or the average density for various food groups. We try to be pretty comprehensive, but we stuck with minimally processed or unprocessed foods, and we just present the results in two different ways. We present the portion size in grams required to meet an average of a third of the requirements across these nutrients, or the portion size in calories. And then we use an algorithm to try to account for the fact that, if a food requires too much mass, like a pound of salad, for example, it's not going to be easy to consume. And if it requires too many calories to provide the nutrients, it's also not going to be dense enough. So we sort of rate different foods by these this rating overall, and then we also do this for individual nutrients. So what we found, just the high level overview, is that unsurprisingly, organs like liver, spleen, kidney, heart are really the top sources across most of these nutrients. Also, small dried fish, these are very common in many countries in Africa and Asia. Small canned fish are good as well. Dark leafy greens, so things like kale, moringa, etc. Shellfish, and particularly the bivalves, so clams, mussels, oysters, but also crustaceans, and then ruminant meat like beef and goat and mutton and lamb, and eggs, dairy, and then fish, particularly with the bones consumed. So that was kind of the high level takeaway. We did a lot of analysis by population group, so that you can say, okay, if you're a woman 15 to 49 years of age, here's sort of the density targets you should be looking for these foods. If you're an average adult, 25 years or older, here are the foods you should aim for.
I'm so excited to announce that we're hosting our first ever live event at the beautiful Snowbird Resort in the mountains of Utah, less than 1 hour from Salt Lake City International Airport, this year over Labor Day weekend from Friday, September 2nd through Monday, September 5th. Let's face it, it's been a hard couple of years. The stress of the virus, the lockdowns, the isolation, the 24/7 news cycle, the polarization, the supply chain issues, our lives have been disrupted in so many fundamental ways. While some of these issues remain, I think most of you would agree that they've lessened in intensity, and the impacts of the pandemic are, thankfully, starting to recede. So it's time for us to come together as a community to connect, relax, recharge, laugh, play, and celebrate this amazing life that we get to live. And to do that in person in the pristine mountains of Utah, one of the most beautiful and breathtaking places in the world. We're still nailing down the exact theme of the event, but it will be something along the lines of how to thrive and flourish in the post-COVID world. I am so excited about this event. It's going to be an incredible opportunity for us to gather in person, connect with people who share similar values and interests, and give ourselves the gift of a rejuvenating and fun retreat in the mountains. If you think you might want to join us and you'd like to be notified when more information is available and tickets go on sale, go to kresser.co/live event, all one word, kresser.co/live event, and enter your email address in the form. And in the meantime, make sure to block Friday, September 2nd through Monday, September 5th on your calendar. I hope to see you in person at the event. So there's so much to unpack here, and really fascinating. I just want to point out a few things that I took away from looking at these charts. And first of all is consistency with some of the previous studies, like the Milo, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, French name study, which I've referred to a few different times. And even though those studies didn't consider bioavailability as this study did, which I want to come back to in a sec, they still largely found that organ meats were at the top of the list when it comes to nutrient density. And of course, this is a drum I've been beating on for a very long time. And
Yep.
I'm struck by the fact that 4 out of the 6 top foods on your list are organs. It's pretty remarkable. Liver, you have to eat 11 calories of liver what is that? Like licking a liver, a piece of liver or something?
I mean,
Or,
yeah, if
I mean, a tiny, tiny little piece this big.
right, it's not much at all, right?
Yeah.
It's tiny.
And I just want to put this in perspective for people who don't, are not looking at the chart right now. So you have to eat 11 calories of liver to reach a third of the recommended intakes of vitamin A, folate, B12, calcium, iron, and zinc for women of reproductive age. In comparison, you have to eat 380 calories of other vegetables. That's not a reason not to eat vegetables, and I have more to say about that. I'll come back to that. You have to eat 1,100 calories of chicken, and you have to eat over 4,000 plus. I imagine the plus means that you could of refined grains, and I imagine the plus means that they're devoid of certain nutrients. So you could eat as many as almost as much as you can handle, and you're still not going to reach those targets.
I had to cut it off somewhere, so I just cut it off. There is there is a portion size, but I don't think it's very realistic to consume. So
right, something bad is gonna happen.
Something else bad is gonna happen if you reach that. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So that's just remarkable. We're talking about a 400-fold difference in nutrient density with these particular nutrients between liver and refined grains. We're talking about even 100-fold difference between liver and chicken, and like a 20-fold difference or 30-fold difference between liver and vegetables, and even vitamin A rich fruits and vegetables. So it's pretty incredible to me that just to see how this actually shakes out in a visual way. It's a highly recommend. I'm not sure if this paper going to be open access, or is it, do you know?
It'll be open access, and it's gonna come out on March 7th. So that's this Monday coming up.
Great. So yeah, I mean, there's the saying, picture is worth 1,000 words, and I think just visually seeing the tables or the charts in the paper itself is very powerful. It really gives a sense of how much more nutrient dense those foods are on the top of the list than foods that are often promoted as being very nutrient dense by certain communities. You've got a lot of the foods that are bottom of the list are things like quinoa, fruits, millet, roots, tubers, and plantains. Whole grains and nuts were at the very bottom of the list, along with refined grain products and refined grains. So I think that will surprise a lot of people, because there's this saying, healthy whole grains, that we hear a lot thrown around. But in reality, at least when we're talking about these specific nutrients, they are not anywhere close to things like organ meats and shellfish and dark leafy green vegetables and ruminant meat and dairy products. So I want to come back to bioavailability, because we were chatting about this before the show, but before we start recording, I've been on Rogan several times, and almost always to discuss the difference in nutrient content between an omnivorous diet or a mixed diet and vegan and vegetarian diets. And I've had debates about this. And often in the context of those debates, I would be referring to the existing scientific literature on this topic, which had, various scales for assessing nutrient density in these foods. But none of those attempts, I don't know about none, but very few of them actually considered bioavailability. And the importance of that for people that aren't familiar with that term is, when you look at an analysis of the amount of a nutrient in a given food, let's just take calcium in spinach as an example. You can look at a cup of calcium and say, oh, wow, or a cup of spinach and say, oh, wow, there's actually quite a bit of calcium in there. But then you realize that the spinach also contains phytic acid, which inhibits the absorption of minerals like calcium. And there have been studies that have shown that you need, I think, something like 8 cups of spinach in order to get the same bioavailable amount of calcium that you get from drinking 1 glass of milk. So in practice, in actual reality, somebody could be misled by just the food label or looking up on nutrition data and seeing how much calcium spinach has. And they might make the assumption that if they eat that spinach, they're going to get that amount of calcium. But it never works out to be 100%. Even with foods where bioavailability is higher, like calcium in milk, you're not getting 100%. You're getting a lower percentage, but it's much higher than you get from eating calcium. So I've always, or eating spinach, I've always been frustrated by the fact that these kinds of studies haven't considered bioavailability. Even though, although I know how hard that is because there's so many different things to consider. Tell us a little bit about, how you did that, and what led to making that. How did you pull it off, given that nobody, this really hasn't been done in a paper like this before?
Yeah. So bioavailability is a really important piece of this to consider because, like you say, there are very different levels of bioavailability of nutrients. There are anti-nutrients like phytic acid, oxalates, etc., that can bind to the minerals and prevent absorption. Some of the nutrients, the recommended intakes are actually designed to account for this. So like if you look at vitamin A, there's something called a retinol activity equivalent, which is assumes about a 12-to-1 ratio of carotenoids to retinol. So that's kind of the average, and there are certainly people who are poor converters. So for them, getting it from animal source foods is more important. But there's a large variation. So if you look at vitamin A, there's a study that showed if you have raw carrots, it's like 77-to-1. If you have cooked carrots, it's with fat, it's much closer to 12-to-1. If you have something like red palm oil, which is full of it's fat, it's actually closer to 2-to-1. So I think there's a lot of nuance in there. We can't always just assume just because you're getting the average, and of course a lot of individual factors. I want to just mention on calcium. I went into this not really knowing what to do about calcium, and I looked into it because, as you point out, there is actually a study that shows the absorption from spinach, and this is spinach in the U.S. is very low. I think it was something like 5%. But when I reviewed, so we of course were looking at countries all over the world. So I reviewed data from Kenya, from India, and there were actually studies that looked at the bioavailability of dark green leafy vegetables overall in very specific varieties. And what we found is that the absorption is actually relatively similar on average if you look at all dark leafy greens. So I think there's probably something, I don't exactly know, but there's probably something with spinach, or at least spinach in the U.S. that has less, absorption. But I think it's an important point. We don't always know about the bioavailability. Now, the two big nutrients that people do not adjust for in individual foods because they're not actually in the requirement is iron and zinc. And so if you look at a package that says percent of RDA and it's black beans versus the steak, it's going to show you something that's not really reflecting the true bioavailability. And so I think that's kind of confusing to consumers. So what we did is we actually, for iron, we looked at the amount of heme iron in each food. And so, in ruminant meat, it's the highest. It's close to 2/3 of the meat of the iron is heme iron, and heme iron is much more bioavailable than non-heme iron. You look at different foods, there's a range. So we calculated a few different estimates based on averages of different foods, and then we gave sort of a 10% absorption estimate for plant foods, and the reason for that is that you don't really have a way to estimate the individual absorption precisely because it depends on how much phytate is in the overall diet. It depends on how much vitamin C is in the diet. It depends on how much animal protein is in the diet, how much heme iron, etc. But we do our best to get at what would kind of be the average scenario here. And so there's actually a difference. So we, in our modeling, we really consider ruminants having the highest amount, about 20% absorption versus 10%. So it's about double the absorption. Now for zinc, there are recommended nutrient intakes at the global level that have been sort of worked on by WHO and FAO and others that say if you have an unrefined diet, so this is like you have whole foods, whole grains, there's no type of refinement to the flours, then your absorption is this amount. And if you have a semi-refined, all the way to where it's like the US where you have an unrefined diet, they assume there's hardly any, which really is kind of the case. Most grains in the US are refined. And that estimate is supposed to be about 300 milligrams of phytate. Now, what's really interesting is that when you look at some of the, if you look at the phytate content of a diet that is largely plant-based, like we looked at the E-Lancet diet, it has about 2,000 to 2,500 milligrams of phytate. And
Wow.
the highest level of phytate for kind of penalizing bioavailability of zinc is 1200 milligrams. So it's sort of off the charts. Like we don't even
Yeah.
know we don't really know what the impact is. It's at the best case scenario is that it's going to have, you basically have to assume the recommended intakes at that sort of what's called the unrefined level. So when the diet's considered to have 1200 milligrams. So we did our best to sort of do an estimate of what would this be on average for individual foods, assuming that people are trying to, you're trying to have a diverse diet and not too high in phytate. But I think these are actually pretty conservative estimates. So it's definitely possible that we're actually underappreciating the bioavailability in animal source foods. I would say this is a pretty fair balance. And if we made an error on either side, it would probably be to favor plant source foods.
Yeah. That's a fantastic point, and everything you just said points directly to the complexity of this issue and why it's been so difficult for researchers like yourself to try to quantify this in a paper. And there's just so many considerations, like I said before, some of which are known and established, but still hard to quantify for the reasons that you mentioned. Like the data might not even be there in the database, or in the case of, like you mentioned, the top level of phytate coming out at 1200 when it's actually much higher in a someone who's eating like a whole foods plant-based diet. And then there are factors that we probably don't even fully understand yet in terms of bioavailability. But I think you did a great job, and I would, just based on my years and years of researching this, and also treating years and years of treating patients who are making different dietary choices and coming to me with that history, I would concur with the guess that this is probably, if anything, an underestimate of how important bioavailability of animal foods are, because that's certainly what I see. Most of the patients who come to me who've been following a plant-based type of diet are not eating, refined grains all the time. They're eating whole
Right.
grains, and they're doing a pretty good job of following that approach. And it's I became alarmed at the level of how quickly some people would develop clear signs of nutrient deficiency, as validated by laboratory assessments that I was doing, and also all of the telltale signs and symptoms that go along with that deficiency. And I think that's probably a result of the pretty significant differences of bioavailability that we're not even fully aware of. While we're on this topic of bioavailability, let's talk a little bit about protein. Um, it seems to me that this has been a little bit easier to quantify, and there's been more efforts in this direction, like the PDCAAS scale, protein digested correctable amino acid score, I think is what it is, which
Mm-hmm.
actually looks at not only how complete a protein is, the full amino acid profile, but also the digestibility of the protein, how much of it has been absorbed by the time it reaches the terminal ileum, which gives us more information than just looking at the amino acid profile. So talk a little bit about the difference between animal and plant foods in your study from that perspective, or in the previous research that you've done.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And my expertise is not in protein, so I will probably say limited things about this, but I will point to that. We also recently put out a paper, and this one has I think you had Stefan Van Vliet on your show.
Mm-hmm.
He was a co-author on this one. It was talking about this sort of reductionist approach to nutrition in a specific case of animal protein, because it's very common in policy spheres to say, let's try to change from animal protein to plant-based protein, and it's sort of equivocate. It's like, this is the same, you just need to produce a kilogram of whatever plant-based food, and there are differences. There are two differences. There's one, of course, on the amino acid completeness and content, and then of course the bioavailability. So in general, animal source foods are superior. What I think, soy is a great option for a plant source food, but in general, from what I understand, if you consume enough protein, this becomes less of an issue. It's really for if you're consuming, let's say you consume the RDA, which is the amount to generally prevent deficiencies. But what I've sort of heard from experts in this, like Stuart Phillips and others, that once you consume about 1.6 grams protein per kilogram of body weight per day, it's less important to make sure you get it from animal source foods. But most people aren't consuming that much. And I think especially when you look at the low and middle income countries, this is where we see it in children. There's a recent study that looked at this. It's like children were meeting the targets for recommended intakes of protein, but the biomarkers of amino acids were actually low, and that actually has an impact on their growth and development. So it's a real issue, and I don't think we can sort of dismiss the issue of protein quality, even though in the West it's much lesser of an issue, and if you consume a lot of protein, you don't have to worry about it too much.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Where, just to reiterate, you can meet the recommended total amount of protein on paper, but if the amino acid distribution is not optimal, you're still going to suffer from the relative effects of protein deficiency. And I think there are some examples of other nutrients where that's possible as well. I want to talk a little bit about the long chain omega-3 fats, because these are also, there are a variety of nutrients that are either only obtainable from animal foods or are mostly obtainable. There might be one or two plant sources, but they're not commonly consumed plant foods, particularly in the American diet. And, retinol, preformed vitamin A is something that stands out there. Heme iron, of course, is only found in animal foods. B12 and vitamin D are all only found in significant amounts in their bioavailable, absorbable forms in animal foods. But then you have EPA and DHA, which, you can get some DHA from marine algae, and that's indeed what I recommend for vegans as a way of supplementing. I don't know a lot of people who are eating marine algae regularly in the US, or even sea vegetables in general. So animal foods become a really vital source of EPA and DHA, particularly if someone's not eating much seafood, which is also not uncommon in the developed world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your point is right. Like, there are ways to get plant sources of omega-3s that are DHA and EPA, but it's not like they're widely available or will be anytime soon, right? And so I think we should keep pursuing that. Of course, let's produce and find ways for people to eat more sea vegetables. They're actually really nutrient dense. So
I love them.
Consuming lots of seaweed, go for it. Like, it's going to be great. But the important point is that when you look at the actual amount that's converted from plant sources like flax or hemp seeds or all these different types of plant sources of omega-3s, they're at best 10 to 1. And honestly, for this is sort of like a best case scenario. It may be quite a bit lower. And so, but if you assume that right there, it's 10 to 1, and it's not like it's going to be easy. First of all, seeds are not easy to eat tons of. And people don't regularly consume that much. So it's a big dietary change. Whereas if you eat, a little bit of fatty fish, it's going to be a much better source. So absolutely. And especially when you look at, again, at low and middle income countries, this nutrient is going to be much more problematic. And that's, has protective factors for, NCD risk factors. So there's non-communicable diseases, and it's really important for brain growth
health,
and
inflammation. Yeah. I mean, here's another example of how complex this gets, and where I think we're often underestimating the impact of these factors determining, bioavailability. In order for that conversion of alpha-linolenic acid to EPA and DHA to take place, certain other cofactors and enzymes have to be present. And those enzymes that are in that biological pathway of the conversion from ALA to EPA and DHA require nutrients like iron or zinc, or the exact kind of nutrients you would expect to be at a higher risk of deficiency on a plant-based diet. So you have a double whammy kind of effect there, where someone on a plant-based diet is not only going to be at risk for, just like everybody would if they're only getting alpha-linolenic, those precursor omega-3s and being able to convert those into the longer forms, but they will be at increased risk as well because of lower levels of the nutrients that are required to make that conversion in the pathway. And I don't think that there are many studies that are considering things at that level, because it's just so complex and difficult to quantify.
Yeah, it's a great point. When you look at metabolomic studies, it's really pretty clear. There are tens of thousands of compounds in foods, and we don't really understand how they impact metabolism and health. And the food matrix plays a major role. It's the same thing in eggs. And even protein digestibility can be improved by consuming the full egg as opposed to just the egg whites. So there's definitely a point about synergistic nutrients, and I think this is sort of my perspective and some colleagues of mine, that this nutritionism reductionist approach can often oversimplify, and it can be unhelpful and problematic in some cases because you're not really considering all of the cofactors in food matrix.
I love that term, nutritionism. That's from Gregory Skrinnis, right?
Yeah.
Are you in contact with him? Do you have a relationship with him?
I have a informal relationship with him. I've exchanged a few emails. I think we share a lot of similar perspectives on diet
Cool.
quality. So yeah, he's great.
I'm going to follow up with you. I'd love to get him on the show. When I first read his paper about nutritionism, it was like, yes, this is exactly what, it was kind of exciting for me in a geeky, nerdy way, because I think he just really hit the nail on the head in terms of the problems with that kind of reductionist approach.
Absolutely.
I want to talk briefly about dairy products, because this is another area of like a lot of controversy and I think misunderstanding, both in the kind of vegan world and also even in a sort of what I might label as like a conventional healthy diet world. Vegan or dairy gets really demonized. Everything from really, I think, kind of spurious arguments like we're the only animal that drinks the milk of another animal. I'm like, okay, well, we're the only animal that uses iPhones too, and flies on airplanes, but that's not necessarily not a reason to do it. Just like milk is totally, is not a nutrient dense food and doesn't have really significant levels of any nutrients. So, yet it appeared pretty high on your list in the study. So what are dairy products rich in? Why should people consider, if they tolerate them and if they don't have an allergy or an intolerance to dairy, why should they consider including dairy products in the diet?
Yeah. So dairy is similar to eggs in that it provides a lot of nutrients. A decent amount of lots of different nutrients. It's not like it's just high in just one source, but of course, calcium is one of those nutrients, and other nutrients like zinc and vitamin A. But there's a lot of things that dairy provides. It's so when you think about it in sort of my field of global nutrition, it's easy for young children to eat yogurt, for example. So it's a really good first food to introducing food. I know both of my girls, that was one of the easiest ways to get a lot of nutrients into them, and so dairy is great. I think with your point, it's sort of dairy is very mixed. What people think of dairy is all over the map. I think of the study, if you think of the global burden of disease study, they consider dairy a positive, like milk is a positive nutrient or ingredient. But something like the recent Food Compass by Tufts, they consider milk kind of negative. Only yogurt is the only dairy that's sort of considered positive, but cheese and milk is scored pretty lowly. So I think there's a lot of perspectives on this, and I think, of course, we don't know everything, but one thing that we know is that the food matrix really plays a role in the health effects of dairy as well. So dairy can be demonized or targeted because of the saturated fat content. But in general, what we've seen from the evidence is that when you have a whole food matrix like a naturally fermented whole milk yogurt, it's not problematic. It's usually associated with beneficial outcomes. And the other thing to keep in mind is that whenever there is sort of some potential negative risk being considered, it's really important to consider the positives. And I think this is done all the time with red meat and with other foods. They're targeted because, if you consume too much in this certain population, you may increase your risk of this, but there's very little consideration of all the benefits. I think you need to consider it holistically to say, what are the potential risks? What are the potential benefits? And in general, for people who tolerate dairy, it's a excellent source of nutrients and protein. So I think it's important, of course, like to consider allergies, intolerances, etc. But in general, I think dairy is a really, really helpful food. And you're right, it came out really high in our study, right? And dairy is not something that's commonly consumed all over the world. So there's actually a lot of room for increasing it where there's desire to do so. And in my organization, Gain, does have some programs where we look to increase dairy production. Um,
Nice. Nice. So I want to just end by kind of bringing this full circle, perhaps, and mentioning that your study, I think appropriately so, focused on essential micronutrients like iron and zinc and B12 and calcium, folate. These are nutrients that cannot be synthesized endogenously, meaning we can't make them on our own. So we have to obtain them from food sources. And they're also nutrients that we know from decades, if not a century of research, are absolutely critical to human health and well-being. And if we develop a deficiency, really bad stuff can happen from the lack of these nutrients. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other nutrients that are important. I just want to make that clear here that were not studied. And these include things like carotenoids, diallyl sulfides, polyphenols, flavonoids, lignans, plant sterols and stanols, prebiotic fibers. These are foods that you would get by eating, or nutrients that you would get by eating plant foods. There's an increasing amount of research pointing to the benefits of these foods above and beyond just those essential nutrients. And this is why I've always argued that, at least as far as we can tell, looking at three different legs of evidence, at what ancestral populations have eaten, archaeological evidence, and then modern clinical, observational research, as well as experimental evidence, that most humans do best on a mix of both plant and animal foods, because those different categories of foods provide different categories of nutrients. Would you agree with that?
100%. I think you look at the nutrient profiles of plant and animal source foods, and they are very complementary. So the nutrients that we didn't talk about, oftentimes these can be of really big importance in Western countries like the US: magnesium, potassium, vitamin C, vitamin E, and even folate is more commonly found in plant-based foods. So I think that's a really important point. Some like to take this study and the figure and say, look, we all need to be carnivores.
Yeah.
And that's not what we're...
I know that will happen. 100%. Sure.
It's going to happen, and I can't do anything about it. But I will just say again, to repeat, I'm not advocating for a carnivore diet for anybody. It's just that there really is a push to reduce or eliminate animal source foods. And when we look at this objectively, we find there's a big role for animal source foods. It doesn't mean that they need to take the majority of your diet, but that they really should be included for optimal health. And if you choose not to consume them, that's great. There's a lot of reasons why people don't, and let's just try to understand the evidence in a balanced way and focus on the nutrients that you need to if you're not going to consume animal source foods.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. I've had many patients who are vegans and vegetarians over the years. I myself, as most of my listeners know, was a macrobiotic vegan for a couple of years, and so I don't come at this with any kind of moral judgment or rigid kind of viewpoint. I just want to provide information that will help people to make informed choices, so that they're not thinking, oh, I'm getting plenty of this nutrient from this food, when in fact that's not the case, because of either issues with bioavailability, or maybe the form of that nutrient being not the right form, like cobamide, and being an analog of B12 but not true B12 in something like algae. So it's really what it's all about. And I appreciate that about you, Ty, and your work is just, it's really about helping people meet these nutrient needs and reduce their risk of disease and just live a healthier and happier life. So appreciate the work you've been doing. I've been following you on Twitter for quite a while now, and I've really enjoyed this paper and all of your previous work, and look forward to what's to come. So where can people learn more about your work and kind of stay up with what you're doing? Like I said, I follow you on Twitter, but what are the best places?
Yeah, I think Twitter is the best place just because I'm most active there. So this is it's Ty R Beal, TYRBEAL. That's my handle, and I'll post a lot of research that I find interesting, or anything that I'm working on. Sometimes I'll even post some sneak peeks at things that haven't been published. So yeah, definitely check it out, and I'll keep updating there.
Awesome. Well, look forward to future research that I know you're working on. I'd love to have you back on the show when some of those papers are published. In the meantime, keep up the good work.
Thanks so much, Chris. I'd love to come back and keep up the good work as well.
All right. Thanks everyone for listening. Send your questions to chriskresser.com/podcast question, and we'll see you next time. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/Chris Kresser or facebook.com/Chris Kresser LAC. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.